Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Incarnational Inkwell podcast. My name is Adam Lacrosse, and this is the show where we develop a deeper relationship with Jesus Christ by diving into literature. So I've been thinking about this big question that's been on my mind recently with the rise of book clubs across the internet, especially within Catholic and Christian circles. This question of should Christians be bookworms? Is there any benefit to strengthening our spiritual life by reading good books? I think that answer is yes, and I want to explore that today with the inaugural episode of my podcast here. Before I go any further, please do like, comment, and subscribe. This is the first episode of my podcast. It is up on YouTube right now, and hopefully it'll be up on podcast formats like Spotify and elsewhere in the future if you want just a purely audio experience. Please do like and subscribe. I will appreciate that, and hopefully I can begin to grow this community as the podcast episode library grows longer and longer. So I think at a very base level, why a Christian needs to read more is because we can use stories, both fictional and non-fictional, as kind of a stepping stone to greater evangelization. Everyone loves a good story. You think about the way that we've been telling stories for thousands of years around campfires. You have cavemen drawing, making paintings, and you have people telling stories from time immemorial, and it's because everyone loves a good story. You've got stories of conversion, many saints who have gone through harrowing times and have come out on the other side through an experience with our Lord. And that can really be a profound way to bring someone closer to Christ, this story of conversion. Not to mention the fact that we have the Bible, the very Word of God, handed down to us in written form, this very divine revelation, this great story, God's love story of how he came to this world in the form of Jesus Christ, died on a cross for us, and saved us. That's the most powerful story I think we can tell, is the story of the Bible. I mean, look at a man like Father Mike Schmitz with his Bible in a Year podcast. It is one of the top, if not the top, religious podcasts in the country right now. And it's because the Bible is such a good story. But even with stories of conversion, even with the great story woven throughout all of the books of the Bible, I still think there's a benefit to reading what's called, quote-unquote, secular literature. This idea that we don't have to always be reading good spiritual books. We don't always have to be reading books written by a saint or a holy person in order to get something out of them. Because oftentimes, when we're talking to maybe our non-Christian friends or an atheist family member, they don't want to hear about the lives of the saints. Their hearts are not ready to receive that message. So I think if you can find a good book and read it together with a non-religious person, that might help bridge the gap. So let me give you a few examples of how the saints have seen literature. In the words of one of my great heroes, John Paul II, he wrote a letter to artists way, way back. I think it might have been the late 90s, early 2000s. And he said this about art and literature kind of being sucked in as a subset of art as a whole. He said, "In order to communicate the message entrusted to her by Christ, the church needs art. Art must make perceptible, as far as possible attractive, the world of the Spirit, of the invisible, of God. It must therefore translate into meaningful terms that which is in itself ineffable. Art has a unique capacity to take one or other facet of the message and translate it into colors, shapes, and sounds which nourish the intuition of those who look or listen. It does so without emptying the message itself of its transcendent value and its aura of mystery. The church has need especially of those who can do this on the literary and figurative level, using the endless possibilities of images and their symbolic force. Christ himself made extensive use of images in his preaching, fully in keeping with his willingness to become, in the Incarnation, the icon of the unseen God. Close quote. So that was a big kind of a philosophical grandstand, a philosophical monologue, if you will, by JP2 on why the Catholic Church needs literature. So let's break that down. Let me kind of give you my interpretation. So first off, the main goal of evangelization is to bring the natural into contact with the supernatural. And so that's why I think this first part is talking about here. Art must make perceptible, and as far as possible, attractive the world of the Spirit of God. It must translate into meaningful terms that which is ineffable. You know, I could talk all day about different theological topics and different philosophical topics, and I did in the past. If you're a previous viewer of this channel, you would know that I went by a different name, and I talked more about theology and philosophy and my different takes on things, being a complete amateur in those fields. But I think literature, as I've been saying, has this way of kind of making the supernatural make sense on a natural level because of literature, because of good stories. Because, as JP2 goes on to state, farther down here toward the end of the quote, the literature does so without emptying the message of its transcendent value and mystery. So there may be still layers of metaphor and symbolism hidden within literature, but on its plain value, just with a very stark, surface level reading, you can kind of see certain things hinted at if the story or if the text is written well, especially a good poem. You can see levels, different layers of meaning if the text is written well. And of course, as JP2 reminds us, Christ himself makes extensive use of images in his preaching, fully in keeping with his willingness to become, in the Incarnation, the icon of the unseen God. Think of his parables. He tells stories, the story of the prodigal son, the story of the lost sheep, the parable of the sower and the seed. And what he's doing is he's making himself known. He's making the realm of the supernatural unknown. He's making it concrete. He's making it tangible. And that's oftentimes what people need. We can get all caught up in abstract theological terminology as much as we want to. But at the end of the day, what will convince the non-religious person, I believe at least, is not just a good argument, although that's definitely needed. We definitely need good arguments, good philosophers, good apologists to make those arguments for the existence of God. But more often than not, we need people who have a good story. Our lives can tell a story. And more often than not, those who are non-religious see our lives, see the story of our lives, and can become convinced because they see our kindness. They see God working through us, his children. Now, of course, I also cannot neglect to mention, and this is a quote that comes to me from a book called How to Read and Write Like a Catholic, written by Joshua Wren. He quotes John Henry Newman as saying that one cannot have a sinless literature of sinful man. So, in further going on with this podcast, I am going to be discussing some very, very heavy topics, some very dense novels, dense short stories with lots of meaning, and not everything is a bed of roses within the realm of literature. You have some very messed up characters. You have some people who do completely horrendous things, and I think it's because the authors at the end of the day know that they are fallen, that they are human beings who struggle and strive for virtue, but they end up sinning. As John Henry Newman says, one cannot have a sinless literature of sinful man. You have to be able to reckon with human weakness, with human failure, with human flaws, in order to have a good story. So that's what the saints kind of said about it. And now, shifting gears to a more personal case for Christian fiction, I want to talk about the 3 people who I believe had the biggest impact on me, the biggest understanding of, wow, here's what literature can do for my own spiritual life. Tolkien, Lewis, and a little bit controversially, J.K. Rowling. So first off, I want to contrast the realms of Narnia, created by C.S. Lewis, and the realm of Middle-earth, created by Tolkien. So Narnia was the first of these 2 realms that I stumbled across. I read the Narnia books in elementary school, and found them to be delightful little tales. And because I was so intimately familiar with the Bible, I could definitely see some Christian parallelism. So, for example, here are the things that I noticed. Aslan is definitely a Christ figure, and there's definitely a sense of darkness surrounding the White Witch if you read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Aslan, Edmund, if you've read the story, goes and he betrays his brother and sisters to the White Witch. The White Witch has power over Narnia. She rules over Narnia in a land of endless winter. But Aslan comes back, he sacrifices himself on the Great Stone Table, and ends up becoming resurrected. And he frees the land of Narnia from the clutches of the White Witch, bringing spring once again, and giving life to all of those who had been turned to stone by the White Witch. So there's definitely a religious element to Narnia. Like C.S. Lewis often said, it's the adults that need fairy tales, or something to that effect. I'm paraphrasing. But he made the claim that, we get to a certain age and we need fairy tales again, because they have messages for us even as adults. Now, of course, within the realm of fantasy, you always have magic, and magic in both Narnia and Middle-earth is portrayed as a fairly dangerous thing. This isn't, Cinderella's fairy godmother being able to rescue her by turning a pumpkin into a coach. It's a fairly dangerous thing to be trifling with, and that, I think, stems from the perception of witchcraft in the real world. Witchcraft in the real world is very real. You have people consorting with all sorts of otherworldly powers that are not divine in nature. They usually are demonic. You have pagan witches who claim to draw upon the power of nature, but honestly, from what I've read, it seems to be more demonic than kind of natural Druidism, even though that's having a comeback. So magic is dangerous. I remember reading, I think it was The Dawn Treader. Yeah, it was The Dawn Treader, where Eustace, the Pensievie's cousin, goes and he finds a dragon hoard, and he goes and he takes some of the gold, and the next morning he ends up turned into a dragon because of his greed. So magic is dangerous, it's unpredictable, it's powerful, very powerful. You see what the White Witch can do throughout her control of Narnia. You see what Eustace was able to do accidentally, turning himself into a dragon by stealing the gold. And it's not always cut and dry, the limits of magic, what it can and can't do. So usually that sort of thing is best left untouched. And you can see that in Middle-earth, too. You've got the One Ring, this very powerful item that can make the wearer invisible, but it also corrupts the user, draws them toward evil. Think of the darkness of sin and the lure of temptation. It draws them toward evil, and it alerts the forces of Sauron, the forces of darkness, to the wearer's existence and the wearer's location. But, as with any good story, where there is evil, there is good, and I'm stealing this from Bishop Barron, who made the connection, that Frodo, Aragorn, and Gandalf are kind of 3 archetypes of Christ. You have Frodo, the priest, who goes and offers sacrifice, throwing the ring into Mount Doom. You have Aragorn, the king, who is the rightful ruler of some nation. I honestly forget. Gondor, I think. I don't know. There's so many nations, and it has been a long, long time since I've read The Lord of the Rings. And then, of course, you have the prophet Gandalf, who goes and he defeats the Balrog in the Fellowship, and then comes back later, rising, starting as Gandalf the Grey, but rising, resurrecting like Christ, and turning to Gandalf the White. So there are definitely spiritual elements in both the works of C.S. Lewis and the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. I do want to mention one more, though, and I think this was my first kind of aha moment as far as hidden Christianity within fiction, and that was J.K. Rowling. You have the realm of Hogwarts, where students go and they practice magic, but unlike the realms of Lewis and Tolkien, magic is a little bit more defined. It's not as vague as far as its limitations. There are things that wizards can do and wizards can't do. There are certain taboos among the wizarding world in Rowling's depiction, like creating the undead. You've got the 3 unforgivable curses. Dark magic is definitely a thing. But magic is seen more as a gift. If you've read the Harry Potter books, you've got the wizards, you've got the muggles, and you've even got squibs, those who are born into a wizarding family, but don't have any magical powers of their own. So magic is seen more as like an innate ability that wizardry helps to foster. So it's more, if I were to parallel it, it would be like God gave you the gift of magic, and you can harness it and perfect it and become better at it through studying wizardry. Of course, I cannot help but mention the main struggle of Harry versus Voldemort. Voldemort, you have this incredibly evil dark wizard who murdered several people in order to create the Horcruxes, splitting his soul into pieces. Of course, that's theologically unsound because the soul is not made up of parts. It can't be composed of anything, therefore it can't divide into anything. I digress. But you have Harry, who in the final book sacrifices himself in order to destroy the last Horcrux, which was Harry himself, and is resurrected. It's not really all that clear how he's able to be resurrected after Voldemort destroys him. I'm assuming it would have something to do with the power of his mother's love. The magic of love is very prominent within the books. The magic of friendship, too. Harry doesn't do this on his own. He also has Ron and Hermione to help him out through his journey, destroying the Horcruxes. Now, I do want to say something that I think might be a little controversial depending on who you ask. I think that Catholics and Christians in general should be allowed to read the Harry Potter books. I know I've heard some exorcists say that, reading Harry Potter can lead people down the road to the occult, can lead people down into real witchcraft. The spells are real. And after doing some digging, the spells are just basically made up Latin gibberish words. Rowling took Latin and she gibberified it, and that's all the spells are. And like I said before, guys, there really is a sense of light overcoming the darkness, the power of love, the power of friendship, and those are Christian themes. Harry coming back is a Christian theme. In fact, there was a book written, I forget the author, called Jesus, Potter, Harry, Christ, and it beautifully draws out the parallels between Christ and Harry in a way that I'm just barely scratching the surface here, guys. So honestly, I am of the personal opinion that Christians can and should read Harry Potter, but I think it's a matter of knowing the Bible first and knowing the Bible more than you know Harry Potter, so you can pick up on those parallels. You can pick up on kind of who's who and how Harry relates to Christ, how Voldemort relates to Satan, etc., etc. So that was a lot, I admit. But I hope I've kind of made the case of why we need to read good literature. Number one, It'll help, I think, convert our non-religious friends. Number 2, we can be strengthened by seeing good Christian heroism on display, even if the characters themselves are not practicing Christians. And number 3, we just need good stories of light overcoming darkness. It's a very cynical world out there. And as great as the Bible is, as wonderful as the Bible is, there are stories about the human race that can portray both the light and the darkness of the human condition just as well as the Bible can. Just as well. So moving forward, this is the first episode of the podcast. What am I doing with this channel? That's an excellent question. So I'm going to be looking at the 4 main types of literature. You've got the short story, so something like Mark Twain. He wrote a couple short stories. You have stories like Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, those short stories. You've got novels, The Great Gatsby, Huckleberry Finn, things like that. You've got poetry, everything from Homer's Odyssey to people like William Blake to Robert Frost. You've got essays that I'll be looking over, things like Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, things like that. So it's going to be a broad range of topics discussed here on the podcast. There will be some spiritual books, like Augustine's Confessions, I know for sure I will be covering, but we won't dive into too many works by saints. So I put there no Introduction to the Devout Life, no Story of a Soul, no Interior Castle. You have podcasts like Catholic Classics by Ascension Presents if you want to listen to discussions of books of a more spiritual nature. This will be focusing more on secular books and what spiritual gems we can glean from secular reading. Now, of course, as with any text, there are many different ways of reading a text. I was trained in a good swath of them, both in my undergrad and graduate studies. So I listed here just a couple of ways you could read a text. You could read it as a Marxist. If you know anything about Karl Marx, he was all about the power struggle between kind of the weak and the strong, both politically and economically. You could read it as a deconstructionist. I know that's kind of a weighted term, talking theologically, deconstructing things and kind of peeling back the layers and flipping things on its head. What if good is evil and evil is good, etc. You've got a queer reading, LGBT, maybe some characters are closeted gays. You've got a feminist reading where they look at the female characters and the gender dynamics, gender roles within a novel or a short story. You've got the last 2 there, historical and reader response. Those are the 2 that I'm going to be focusing on in this podcast. First off, the reader response. I'm going to be spouting off my opinions of the texts we're reading. And literally that's all they are. I'm not an authority on anything. I'm not a scholar. I don't do research. I'm just giving you guys my interpretation of these texts. And it is my hope that they will be spiritually beneficial in some way. Just giving you guys my thoughts and having you guys post your thoughts down in the comments, and we can hopefully really form a community around a love of literature. And of course, historically, I'm going to be trying to do a little bit of research when we come to a particular text about the historical context surrounding the story. Why did the author write it? What kind of situation economically and historically was the author living in? Things like that. What sort of major historical events helped shape what the author was writing? Things like that, basically. So I've talked a lot, and I do want to bring to your attention kind of one last major theme. We are going to be reading what are called, quote-unquote, canonical texts. And I've defined canonical texts this way. Canonical texts are texts which have survived the test of time, and they are still relevant today. So there can be books that come out here in the year 2024 that are just kind of what I call fluff reading. Think about your little dollar store romance novels, your books that they're little short, light, fun reads, but they don't really have much of an impact. They don't really have much of an oomph, in my opinion. They don't really make you think. They're just a way for you to be entertained. But the canonical texts are a bit different because the canon, and I'm not talking about the biblical canon here, the literary canon is quite large. You've got the world literary canon, which encompasses everything that humanity has ever written, and you have smaller canons within that canon. I've listed the British literature canon, the canon of American literature, categorizing by country. You've got the canon of women's literature. You've got the canon of African American literature, Chinese literature. You can dice things every which way to Sunday, but the canon, largely speaking, is going to be the world literature canon. I'm gonna kind of zoom out and then narrow down as the podcast kind of expands and grows into more and more episodes. So those are the kind of texts we'll be reading, canonical texts, and I will be listing some starting texts in the YouTube description as we start, so you guys can get a little bit ahead. You guys can start your reading. I'll be posting the reading list here shortly within the next couple of videos or so you kind of know what we're reading. If you have any suggestions about what you think I should discuss or what you would like to see discussed on the podcast, please do leave a comment below, because I want to be able to read as much as possible, but I'm not going to be able to read everything. I'm going to try, but, we definitely will see. One last note about the canon. I said I'm going to start with World Lit, and that's because World Lit has been around the longest. The country of Britain is old. You think all the way back to the Middle Ages, and you've got texts like Beowulf, you've got texts like Chaucer, you have things like Gawain and the Green Knight, Le Morte d'Arthur by Mallory, and Britain's been around a long time, and America has been around for quite a long time, but the world, that's just the beginning of civilization as far as their literature is concerned. So I want to take a historical approach. I want to take a chronological approach, which means we will be starting from the beginning of civilization. So we'll be starting with texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh. We'll be starting with texts like Homer. We'll be starting with texts like the Ramayana from India, or Confucius and the Analects from China. And we'll be making our way. It'll be a very slow, gradual process up to the 21st century. It'll be many seasons of this podcast. So if you're sick of hearing my voice, maybe this isn't the podcast for you, but I hope that you'll learn something. I hope we can discuss some stuff. But I do want to leave you with one final thought, because I know you're thinking, wait, the Bible is taught as literature in some college courses, and the Bible, how can you say the Bible isn't a canonical text, Adam? The Bible is a canonical text, but for our purposes, I do not want to be treating the Bible solely as a piece of literature to be examined and dissected and ripped apart with all of these interpretations. Lectio Divina is kind of for that purpose, because we do need to be treating the Word of God with reverence, with respect, with proper due holiness, because it is the Word of God. So I do hope that you have learned a lot today. I hope you will join me next time for our next episode. We'll be diving into some of the historical implications of the ancient world and how that shaped the beginnings of literature. But until then, I hope you all have a wonderful day, and God bless.